All right, folks. Well, good morning. Apologies for the small delay. It's Yasser El-Ansari here, Chief Executive at the Australian Investment Council here in Sydney, we are just about to get into our session this morning, joined by our two expert commentators, Steve Okun and Simon Jackman. We're just having a final bit of technical issue to resolve with Simon's connection, but we do have Steve online now, which is great. Thank you so much, Steve, for being a part of this conversation this morning alongside Simon. Great to have you on board all the way virtually, of course, via Singapore.
Well, it was tough making it up to my third floor today, but I did it. Yasser, so.
That's good. That's good.
Good to be back in Australia virtually, anyway.
That's right. Yes, thank you. And those of you online will know Steve is a very big part of the AIC's work, has been for a number of years and remains so today. And he is, of course, the founder and CEO of APAC Advisors. He's a leader on corporate public affairs, sustainability, stakeholder engagement across Asia Pacific. He's had a long career in the business sector as well as in our own private capital industry across key markets in the US, Asia and Australia. He's a leader in corporate public affairs, sustainability, stakeholder engagement, and he served in the administration of former US President Bill Clinton. He presents and advocates the views of the US business community in Asia, including as a periodic commentator in the media on channels such as CNBC. He's got deep insight into US politics and the political process. Some of you may know, but Steve is, of course, a former board director of the council and remains a regular contributor to our work in key areas such as ESG and responsible investment. Simon, once he is online with us, hopefully not too far away, I'll do a very brief introduction for him while we get things going. Professor Simon Jackman is the CEO of the United States Study Centre here in Sydney. He commenced in that role back in 2016. He's a Brisbane boy and received his PhD in political science from the University of Rochester and spent most of his academic career, in fact, as a professor of political science and statistics at Stanford University in the US. And clearly that insight garnered through many years spent on the ground in the US is a big part of the deep experience and expertise that he has around public opinion and politics in the United States, as well as the role of political participation, election campaigns and electoral systems. Importantly, has as deep an insight into Australian politics and the crossover between intersection between American and Australian politics, I should say. So we're going to get underway now. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to lead off, Steve, with you, if that's all right. It's almost 100 days since President Biden was sworn into office. I think per my rough accounting skills, just under 100 days at the moment, but it's been a pretty busy period, it feels like. Over to you first on this one. At a high level, tell us all a little bit about where President Biden's focus has been in the first 3 or so months since being sworn in, Steve.
Well, I think the number one focus, of course, is COVID, and then with COVID comes the economy. It's the greatest health crisis facing anyone, in the century now. And if the U.S. gets this right, then that means that Joe Biden is going to be having a successful presidency, or certainly a more successful one if the U.S. doesn't get this right. So that is where the focus is. It's very much a focus, I think, of every government right now is on COVID. And so he's not keeping, he's keeping his eye on the ball. And with COVID comes the economy. Now, but the other thing that's happening at the same time, and we can do a deeper dive on this, is the change in foreign policy and the change in the foreign policy approach from the Biden-Harris administration, to the Biden-Harris administration from the Trump administration. And it's very clear that there's going to be a key focus is going to be on alliances and multilateralism. And those are probably the two most important words in difference from the Trump administration, which was very much a unilateral approach to foreign affairs. And that is going to have huge implications for everyone, but it's going to have a lot of opportunities, especially for countries like Australia, which is now seen as a partner by the United States, as opposed to just seeing as, in some ways, from an economic perspective, as a trading partner and not part of how you address China. So that's, I think, the biggest difference you've seen in the 100 days, and it's going to get more important.
So does some of that change, Steve, represent a reversion back to something that starts to look and feel a little bit more normalized, if there is such a thing these days? You know, we're all very accustomed over the past 4 or so years to, certainly here in an Australian context, you know, decisions, commentary by former President Trump, tended to be lead stories on our 6 p.m. news bulletins now, whereas when I sit down and watch the news, hearing a little bit about what President Biden is up to is actually more challenging. You have to go and search for the information. It's not making the 6 p.m. news bulletins anymore. Does that tell us something about a more normalized approach that perhaps we've lost a little bit of over the past 4 years, shall we say?
Yeah, it's a 180. I mean, the Trump approach, right, on, you know, trade. We'll talk about trade as an example. The Trump approach on trade was unilateral. The Trump approach was, we have the world's biggest market. We are the biggest player on the block, and that we have more advantage when we go one-on-one, because anytime the United States goes one-on-one, it's bigger. It has an advantage. It can bully its trading partners. And the judgment from the President Trump was solely based on the trade deficit. If the U.S. has a trade deficit with you, that's all that matters, and that's a negative, and we have to address that. The Biden shift is back to the U.S. is stronger when it works with its allies. The U.S. is stronger in approaching China when it works together, with Japan and India and Australia and others in the EU, and not just on its own. So that is a huge difference. And then the other difference is that the multilateral forums are to the U.S. advantages. So come back to the World Health Organization, come back to Paris on climate. Don't make all the noise you've been making about NATO. So total differences, and it's going to give, I think, long-term, a lot of opportunities for those countries that are like-minded to the United States when it comes to the international order. But it is going to have some shorter-term challenges as well. And investors need to be looking at both the short-term and the long-term when it comes to the shift in the reversion back to a multilateral trading system.
Yeah, no question about that. The implications from a trade and from an investment perspective is something I'm very keen to explore a little bit further, of course, Steve, throughout this discussion. A quick check. I think we're still waiting on Simon and his technical connection issues. Hopefully that'll be sorted out in the background as we continue the chat. But Steve, I might turn the focus now to a couple of the very specific things that we have, of course, heard a lot about, not just here in Australia, but global markets have certainly been paying quite some considerable attention towards the recent stimulus package that President Biden has put into play. I think something in the order of about $1.9 trillion of economic stimulus bundled up in this most recent package. But despite what appears to be a broad-reaching economic stimulus plan that seeks to drive and rebuild momentum across the economy, it's actually been met with quite a bit of criticism in the US, hasn't it? I think some of the argument has been that the spending was seen by some commentators as being too large and perhaps even unnecessary. I've seen commentators express a view that the economic recovery in the US is already well underway, and so some very significant questions being asked about whether the size quantum of that economic stimulus package was in fact necessary. But given the importance of the US economy to global markets, including here in Australia, how do you read that decision to put $1.9 trillion of spending into the domestic economy, and what are the implications broadly for markets like Australia coming out of that?
So I think you've got to go back, if you're the Biden administration, you go back to the Obama administration, and the Obama administration they took two lessons away from that. The first, the signature package of the Obama administration, of course, was health care, right? Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And that is very popular today in the United States. It was not very popular when it passed, and it wasn't very popular 2 years later when the Democrats got wiped out during the midterm elections. And the lesson that the Biden team has taken from that was that the Obamacare was good policy, bad politics, and it was because it wasn't big enough, it wasn't immediate enough, and the people didn't feel the benefits from it right away. The benefits were designed to be felt 6 years down the road. So the Biden administration has said, and the president has said, we are going to pass something that people are going to recognize immediately that brings them benefits. And the mistake is you'd rather go too big than too small, right? If you really kind of get one shot at this in the Congress, especially because of the way the US system is set up with a process called reconciliation that we could talk about later. But you got one shot at this. The president said, I'd rather make the mistake in going too large than make the mistake in going too small. So lessons from Obama: go big, go immediate, and boost the US economy and let people see it. Get money into their pockets, right? Get the shots into the arms, get everything done you can get done. And that is going to give massive opportunity for investment in the United States, especially, and we can talk about this next, especially if it's followed up with an infrastructure bill. I think that's number one. Number two was people don't care in the United States. People talk about bipartisanship. They want bipartisanship. Obviously, the U.S. system, as you know, is extraordinarily different from the parliamentary system Australia has. And so people say, we don't care if this passes with 1 or 2 Republican votes or 10 Republican votes. We just want it to pass. And if it passed and it helps us, that's good. So I will correct you on one thing. You said, well, the commentators were against this, and this had a lot of opposition. That bill had about a 65, 70% approval rating. Most Americans, most Americans can't agree on anything to get to 65 or 70%. They agreed on that one. And so that is, what the president is going to say. He doesn't define bipartisanship by getting 10 Republican votes in the Senate or 30 Republican votes in the House. He defines bipartisanship as what the people say. And if you can get 65, 70% agreeing on something, he's going to do it.
Yeah. That makes sense, particularly in the context of the previous 4-year period, of course, where you had very little by way of that level of public support, as you quite rightly say. So you touched on the second part to this theme around economic stimulus, Steve, which is all about infrastructure. And I think a couple of weeks ago, President Biden moved to unveil the next major piece of the economic recovery plan, as he's referring to it, which is a $2 trillion infrastructure building package. I think it includes spending on everything from roads through to broadband internet technology across the states, water and manufacturing plants and facilities, all the while promising to create hundreds of thousands of desperately needed new jobs across the economy. And he's touting the plan, Steve, as not just an economic stimulus plan on many levels, but also the positive impact that it will have, that he believes it will have on transitioning the US economy towards a more clean energy future. One of the more controversial elements of this, which of course many of us have heard a lot about recently in US commentary here in Australia as well, and that is the proposal to fund that $2 trillion in infrastructure spending package by lifting the corporate income tax rate from what was 21, or what is, I should say, 21%, which was actually reduced significantly down from the low 30s in President Trump's administration. The proposal in this package is to lift that rate back up from 21 to 28%, alongside other reforms to the tax system, which will enact things like a removal of some of the eligibility for deductions for offshoring and sending jobs to other markets effectively, as well as further and deeper crackdowns on tax havens. What do you make of the plan, Stephen? What do you think the features of that package might need to be in order to secure greater Republican support in Congress. Not that they necessarily need that Republican support, I think I'm right in saying, because they do have the majority in both houses now. But I'm sure more support rather than less, if it's possible, is something that Biden would look to achieve. But what do you make of that package, and again the implications of that for global economies and for markets like Australia?
So there's two ways to think about that question. The first is, what's the definition of infrastructure, and then the second is, how do you pay for it? Back when I was at the Department of Transportation, the second secretary I worked for, Rodney Slater, Secretary Slater would say, "Well, transportation is about more than concrete, asphalt, and steel, right? It is inherently about people, and so now it is." The transportation you have to think about it from a sustainable perspective, and sustainability covers both the environment and it covers, racial inequality in the way you've seen, highways cut off neighborhoods. And so the predominantly Black neighborhoods are completely disadvantaged by infrastructure spending that we had, going back 50 years or so. And so the first question you've got to get to is, how do you define infrastructure? If you just defined it as concrete, asphalt, and steel, if it was just about roads and ports, and electrical grids and the like, you'd get it to pass the Congress relatively easily. But that is not how the Democrats are viewing it. You now have to view it with a sustainability lens, both socially and environmentally. That debate is still going to play out, and where we don't know yet where that's going to happen. The bill could be split in half. You get the first part on the traditional infrastructure definition. That would pass overwhelmingly, I think, with Republican support. Then you would go for part two, that gets to more of the sustainability piece, or you get some hybrid. All of that is going to be a challenge to get worked out over the next month or so. The second question is, how do you pay for it? And the more you put in terms of green technology, electric vehicles, batteries, healthcare, all the things that do make up transportation and infrastructure, that's going to get more expensive. The more you're going to have to raise taxes. It's not going to be an outright stimulus like we had in the first bill that passed. There's a cap on how much taxes that the Republicans will let go up. There's a cap on how much taxes the Democrats will let go up. The president's proposal was a 28% rise on corporate tax. The more moderate Democrats, like the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, wants it at 25%. So that debate's going to play out. But the market seem to think that we're going to have a tough time in the United States passing an infrastructure bill. I tend to remain optimistic on it, although infrastructure is the best idea that never gets passed. So we'll see what happens.
Always challenges, absolutely. Thank you, Steve. Simon, welcome. Apologies, Zoom didn't look after us as well as it normally does this morning, but great to have you online.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
I've introduced you to our audience, so there's no need for us to do that again now that you're with us. But I'm going to turn straight to you, straight into the conversation, Simon, on this one. Your views on the proposed infrastructure spending package and the accompanying changes to the tax rate. Any different insight from the work that you do to Steve's views?
Not really. I think Steve nailed it. Democrats, and Biden in particular, isn't of a mind to let a crisis go to waste. So there's a very flexible, expansive definition of infrastructure here at the moment. But the political reality is that, yes, while nominally and as a formal matter, Democrats control both houses, the Senate is 50-50. And that 50th, if you will, Democratic senator, as Steve pointed out, Joe Manchin from West Virginia. The thing Australians need to remember about West Virginia is that Biden got 29% of the vote, right? It's a 70-30 red-blue state. And Manchin has managed to carve out a personal vote, as we'd call it in Australia. And it's a coal-rich state too. Now, he's not up until 2024, but basically what he wants is the deal. He is the deal maker at the moment. And he flexed his muscle a little bit on the $1.9 trillion COVID recovery bill. Again, I think that was a bit of a test run. but it's really hard to see him being too aggressive on a rise in the company tax rate. That'd be a tough vote for him to defend in West Virginia. But in the substance as well, I'm really struck, like with this climate summit coming up later this week. Inside that $2 trillion infrastructure package is about 170 billion to support the production, rollout, and a battery network for electric vehicles. Things, once you start pushing in that direction on green pieces, which is so core to what Biden wants to do and what a lot of the Democratic Party want to do, all of a sudden that gets hard for Joe Manchin and moderates in the House. So I think we have to really temper our expectations about what that infrastructure bill might do. But a couple of things to say about it from an Australian perspective, real quickly. One is just a straight up commercial opportunity there. I think Australian big institutional investors in particular look at those infrastructure projects in the US, and that is the sort of investment that a lot of Australian super funds really get excited about and attracted to. And why there was a lot of frustration with the Trump era that there wasn't more of that coming online. So are there possibilities there? Something to watch, number one. Number two, if there is real takeoff in the renewable space in the US, that'll create some updrafts for Australian suppliers, smaller and medium perhaps players in the Australian space that are perhaps looking for a high volume partner in the United States, something to keep an eye on, as well as particularly if the big version of that got up. All of a sudden, the US going head to head with China in terms of the take up of EVs, anything around lithium gets very exciting, and that's a good news a story for Australia as well. So there are. I mean, we're essentially we're entering a bit of a new phase more globally too. Part of the recovery from COVID and the changing geostrategic environment, we'll get to that a little bit later. The state is back in the game, and we don't call it industry policy or picking winners and losers, but boy, oh boy, the sums of money that are being talked about with some of these spending plans in the US in particular. There is an awful lot that's gonna move markets and create opportunities all over the place. I think we just have to wait and see what form that ultimately takes as it works its way through a very fraught political environment in the Congress.
Yeah,
and I just want to build on one point that Simon made in talking about like the U.S. version of industrial policy, is that you also have one of the lessons of COVID is reshoring of supply chains and how critical it is to be manufacturing your chips, your medicines, the ingredients that go into medicines. And so you're going to see more investment from, US government led into bringing that type of manufacturing back to the United States. So that is also going to be driving this investment that, as Simon notes, is going to, need a lot of investment and open up opportunities for investors like the super funds and others.
Yeah. So how does, a quick follow-up on this one to you both, how do governments, we see, of course, very similar political challenges in some ways, Simon, with your reflections just now here in the Australian market, don't we? We see some real challenges coming up for our federal government in the budget that's only a couple of weeks away now, 3 or 4 weeks away now, around how government intervention in the markets, how big spending packages start to be withdrawn and the impact that has, particularly when you start thinking about long-term investors seeking to make decisions on the basis of, the government's more active hands-on role, shall we call it. How do governments in the US and Australia deal with that? How do you ensure that you carefully exit your active role in a way that ensures that you carefully manage that balance that you've helped to bring about in the economy?
I'm happy to take a quick swing at that. Look, I think the answer is very slowly. I think we're in this world for a while yet,
Mm.
for two principal reasons, perhaps even three principal reasons. One is before COVID, there's all this anxiety about China, frankly,
Mm.
and we all know that in Australia, right? It's particularly those of us in the business political world straddling those two worlds. COVID just hit, was fast forward on that. Boy, oh boy, this is what exposure and a lack of sovereign capability, resilience, all those sorts of words that are thrown around to describe it. And I think if I would assess the mood in Canberra, at least right now, there is not a great inclination, and Washington, by the way, I think both governments are of this. There is not a mad rush to get back to, from a government perspective at least, to get back to just-in-time inventory and supply chain management. I think this was the proverbial capital W wake-up call. Crystallizing anxieties about the dependency on China as a supplier for so many things. And by the way, you start to dig into the data on this. Australia is way more exposed as China as a single source of supply on commodity after commodity, and also on the outbound, right? For an export market for us as well. So I think in Canberra, at least, the mindset is like, boy, oh boy, we've dug ourselves into a bit of a hole here. It's going to take a while to unpick. But we're not going to let the crisis go to waste. And conversations I have every week with both elected and senior bureaucrats in Canberra, that is very much the mindset of the Australian government now. It is ideologically a weird space to be in, to be sure. We've got otherwise, conservative, small c conservative members of a Liberal National Party government talking big time about the state is driving this. This is state-led, to be sure. And you even had the outgoing US ambassador here in the United States, A.B. Calverhouse, saying, and he's a Reagan era type Republican guy. And he's going, I can't believe it, but here we go. We're doing industry policy and I'm a Republican. And I think we're in that mindset. Certainly people in government are there, number one. Number two, the public opinion on this is diabolical. Even in Australia, the anxieties that withdrawing levels of government support that have been provided is profound. And right now, I think there's this, the expansive printing money almost mindset of democratic governments, I think is probably here for a little while. I don't think sort of jamming, shifting down a gear big time or hitting the brakes hard is politically palatable pretty much anywhere. The recovery is just a little too fragile and too early to really start withdrawing. That we'll see how we go over the rest of 21 into 22. But I don't detect a lot of appetite for that, and for the business community, I think it's sort of get used to this as the new normal to some extent. Number one, the state taking a much more active role, not just scrutinizing foreign investment, which is the big one in Australia, right? The FIRB thresholds came down to zero during COVID. And we've got a piece of work that our senior economist here, Steve Kirchner, whose office I'm gesturing towards over there, but we released that this week. It got a little bit of a write-up in the Financial Review, that this is not going away. And I think the business community needs to get to the new normal. The thing that the Australian government is looking to do here is to say to the United States, hey, we're your trusted partner. We've already got a good thing going on the Linus play and some critical materials being sold back into the US with the US government as frankly as an investment partner. What more like that can we do? And I think for the business community, I think keep a very close eye on that. I think because there could be some real surprising small to medium-sized opportunities pop. Again, often it'll be the surprising sort of good news story for a small to medium enterprise that all of a sudden has landed that supply, that contract in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. That's the sort of scale that you get once you can crack, say, a DOD procurement contract or something like that. And I think the Australian government is looking to go really hard at that. So there are a few sort of observations about the world we're in.
And I think that both governments and businesses are now aligned in how they look at investment in supply chains. And kind of the evolution was, right, the beginning was, it was all about just in time, right? It was about having a just in time supply chain. And it was a very, a supply chain that was very spread out. And it was predominantly, you manufacture in China and then you can, ship where you need to ship. And so it was just in time. And then it moved to diversify your supply chain. So that it got to be, for a lot of businesses, a China plus one, right? So you're going to still manufacture in China, but it's getting a little bit more expensive. So now let's set up our second manufacturing hub in Vietnam or Malaysia, or Mexico, wherever it might have been. And so it went to China plus one. So you went from just in time to diversification. Today, it's all about resilience. How do you have a resilient supply chain? And a resilient supply chain is not going to rely on one or two markets. Governments don't want to see that, and businesses don't want to see that. Governments don't want to see it because of the threat you could have, where one country could shut down your access to critical minerals, where it could shut down your access to critical medicines. Businesses don't want to see it because a pandemic in one country could shut down your business operation. So they're now aligned for slightly different reasons, but it's all about resilience. And that is going to change how businesses operate and how investors need to understand where their supply chains are.
Steve, a quick follow-up on this one. In a private capital industry context, what does all of that mean? What does a more expansive interventionist role, or maybe an activist role in markets and economies mean for private capital investors, do you think?
Well, your political risk is much greater, and so if you're an investor going into Australia, and that business relies heavily on China, you're going to be trying to understand where China-Australia relations are. You probably weren't thinking about this. Certainly weren't thinking about it 10 years ago. You probably weren't thinking about it 5 years ago, maybe not even 2 or 3 years ago. So political risk is now much more of a calculus when it comes to investment, because you have to understand the bilateral relations. You also have to understand with businesses having resilient supply chains, you're now going into markets where there's a lot more ESG risk, right? You're going into markets where there's a lot more risk in terms of forced labor, where there's environmental degradation, and investors are caring about that. And so if you've got an ESG policy, your ESG policy may not have changed from 2 years ago to today, but the way you implement it, what becomes a material factor for ESG, is different now than it was a year or two ago. And that's something that the investors, like the GPs, the private equity firms, the private capital firms, need to understand, because their LPs are going to be asking about that.
Yeah, sure. And I want to talk some more about ESG, responsible investment, in a couple of moments. Steve, I'm going to come back to you now, moving away a little bit from the economic themes into international relations, diplomacy, and of course trade, which accompanies those big picture challenges. Biden's administration has already signaled a pretty clear and different approach when it comes to the way it will engage at diplomatic levels and at trade levels. And you touched on aspects of this a little bit earlier in our introductions. One of the themes, of course, is that the US must start with a mindset which is diplomacy rooted in freedom and upholding universal human rights. What are some of the key changes that you can see already from that shift in messaging and a return to a more normalized values-based approach, as we were saying earlier, to international relations with key markets such as China? And I'm going to have a follow-up question for you around ESG on the back of that, but just your reflections on what the shift in messaging means to this point, at least.
Well, there's going to be two challenges the Biden administration is going to have. One is we're as the United States, we're going to lead with our values, and I want to say we, obviously, the values the U.S. and Australia hold are the same. So we're going to be much more focused on human rights when it comes to trade, and that challenge is going to be in Xinjiang, and you're going to see already, banning of cotton and banning of tomatoes which are having a huge impact on supply chains, but then also having a huge impact on businesses, because now businesses are trying to balance, well, you're going to have to comply with US sanctions and not using cotton from Xinjiang. At the same time, you're manufacturing in China for the Chinese consumer, where they expect you to use their own cotton for their own products. And so you see what's happening to businesses like Nike on one end and H&M. I mean, if you actually, so H&M, which signed on of support of not using cotton in Xinjiang because, as governments described, that's where a genocide is taking place. If you actually go into like the Google Maps version, or the Apple Maps version of maps in China, the H&M stores have been eliminated. they're gone. It is, so you are really, you know, and that pressure is going to increase, not decrease over time. And the next issue that investors need to be thinking about is polysilicon. So Xinjiang alone accounts for about 45% of the materials that go into solar panels around the world. What happens if you can't source, you know, polysilicon from Xinjiang, and you are in a renewables investor anywhere in the world? It is going to greatly impact your ability to get your supply chain, to get your supply. And so businesses now are diversifying out of, they need to know where the polysilicon in the solar panels, not where they're manufactured, where's the polysilicon coming from? They're diversifying out. If you haven't started to diversify out of Xinjiang yet, and we get to this sanctions, you are going to have a difficult time as an investor and as a business. And that's why you need to be more aware. It's not just talk when the US government says we're going to lead with our values. It's going to have a real impact on your business. And I'll just close with this. And then the other impact, what the US and China are trying to do on climate, is that President Biden has said, look, we can confront China where they need to be confronted, such as on human rights. We can compete with China where we should compete with them. We can talk about that in a bit. And we'll cooperate where it's in our national interest to cooperate. And it's in their national interest to cooperate. And obviously climate is the number one. Pandemics are number two. China has said, well, don't expect to cooperate with us when you're attacking us and interfering with our internal domestic politics. We just saw Senator Kerry, the U.S. climate czar, in Beijing, trying to bring some type of way that the U.S. and China can work together. Will that happen, which is in both China and the U.S. interest, while there's this dispute over genocide in Xinjiang and the treatment of Hong Kong and the treatment of Tibet and the treatment of Taiwan? It is going to be very challenging. But if you can confront, compete, and cooperate at the same time, massive opportunities for investors on the renewable space, but keep your eye on solar in Xinjiang at the same time.
Simon, is it going to be possible, do you think, for Biden to play that multi-dimensional relationship role with a market like China?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for now, I'd continue to say yes. I think there is great resistance to any sense of linking or being open to linking even things you want to cooperate on, like climate change, in exchange for some grand bargain on security. We're going to look the other way on Xinjiang or the South China Sea or Hong Kong or even Taiwan. It's very hard to look at the messaging coming out of the Biden administration and see that they're within 100 miles of that. They are working so hard to separate those domains rhetorically, and nothing. I parsed the statement that came out of the communique that came out of the Kerry meeting in Beijing, in Shanghai, China, very carefully. Is there even the door opening on that? But round two is later this week. What will the Chinese say at the climate summit that Biden's convening? I think we're all watching that very carefully. The Australian government is watching that like a laser beam, given our equities and our exposure to this. And our ambassador, Arthur Sinodinos in Washington, says there is no way that the US is ever going to do that. And I think that's the right read. China may have a different view of the matter, and we'll see where we land. But it's interesting, these words: cooperate, compete, climate, and action on climate change will itself become something they compete on for
Yeah.
soft power cred. And
Yeah.
this is kind of part of what Biden's up to. Like right now, China is the world's leading, market in EV and in take up, and I think the US understands that's the battle for hearts and minds through the balance through mid-century, among other things. But that's a really big one. And the idea that the US and the West gets left in the dust by a rising China on a core consumer technology of the future, one with huge greenhouse emissivity sort of implications like that. That's part of the great game as well. And so it is cooperation on climate change, but there is also very much, I think, a competition for the future aspect to some of the moves we're seeing around climate as well.
Building on that, Steve, I'm going to come back to the ESG theme and climate change, perhaps as one of our final topics for you and Simon in a few moments, if that's okay. Can I just go down a slightly different pathway on the back of the discussion about China and international relations with China? Simon, perhaps to you on this one.
Yep.
The other big challenge, of course, from an international relations and diplomacy perspective that Biden has in some ways inherited, perhaps unwillingly, is the role and the relationship between the US and China, US and Russia. I'm sorry, and we've seen just in very recent times, Biden seems to have taken some pretty swift action to deal with that long-running controversy as well. I think he's expelled diplomats from the US. He had a conversation reportedly with Putin directly to advise him of that expulsion and the imposition of some trade sanctions. So he's sort of signaling a pretty deep appetite to just tackle issues head on. We talked a little bit about China just now, but Russia is, of course, another one, and particularly in the eyes of the US populace. He's not afraid to tackle these issues, alongside, of course, his announcement just in the past few days to withdraw all US troops from Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of the September 11 bombings later this year. Do you think all of this is about Biden signaling a different form of engagement between the US and counterparts around the world? And in some ways, is it a move to reassert the US's dominance in global leadership terms?
Yeah, yes to all of the above. I'll keep this quick because I really want to hear from Steve on this. But yes to all of the above. The other thing on Russia, the backswing there has been huge, right? You've got, right, like guys like Biden, who served alongside John McCain in the US Senate, just absolutely disgusted by Trump getting close to Putin. You've got to, right. I heard directly from McCain shortly before he passed away, the last year of McCain's life, at a few, just the level of disgust that the US, the sworn enemy of the US, a country that's being run by a former KGB colonel, essentially sort of a mafia state capitalism. The idea that the US is trading away its prestige and its national interests are being compromised and the final straw is election interference back inside the United States, by someone they regard as a punk. It's really visceral for, I think, particularly politicians of Biden's generation who spent the bulk of their political careers driving the Soviet Union into the ground during the Cold War and doing so successfully. It's just like, you've got to be kidding. And I think calling out Putin, make my day, is sort of Joe Biden's take on that. And moreover, offering real reassurance to European partners as well. And that and sort of bring up a bit of space, frankly, to get back on the main game. And that's China. And there's multi-dimensional competition for, frankly, the 21st century. That's the main game. So telling Biden, you're a punk, I'm going to treat you like a punk, get back in your box. I think sending some very clear messages like that he's not going to countenance that. And we know your game. I've seen you before. Get back in your box. That's kind of the message on Russia. Afghanistan's a little interesting. I just try to look, on the whole, it's got to be good news that the US is winding down its longest war. On the other hand, you ask American, in public opinion surveys, American people still call terrorism their number one big fear.
Yeah.
China is kind of abstract and still, you know, they get the human rights thing and they understand they're probably not good people and they don't mean the US well. But if one thing 20 years of fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan did was take the fight there, and there hasn't been a 9/11 event since 9/11, thank heavens.
Yeah.
US strategic priorities would turn in a heartbeat if there were ever another major terrorist event on US soil.
Yeah.
And for those of us that think China is the main game, keeping the US focused on that is sort of core business. So there's a little bit of countervailing opinion around that I'm a little bit sympathetic to, that 4,000 troops in Afghanistan is actually not bad insurance, gives you a bit of bandwidth to make sure, to make sure that the main strategic game stays on China. So they're just two quick thoughts about the Russia and the Afghanistan play.
Thanks, Simon. Steve, anything to add?
No, I would just say if you're looking at U.S. politics now, the threat of terrorism is very high, but it's now domestic terrorism, right? I mean, it's now white nationalists, it's and QAnon and all of those things happening. So yeah, Afghanistan is but part of the problem is we've been there 20 years because no one talks about it anymore. And I think you know, you can't underestimate that, you know, President Biden had a son who served in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and who, you know, as the father of a veteran, he says, I think he's the first father who's had somebody serve in 40 or 50 years. You know, this is somewhat personal to him as well, and so it is going to have that shift in policy. But as Simon says, you know, you've got to keep the picture on China and on Asia. It is why it is, you know, very telling that the first in-person meeting President Biden had was with Japan. It's why they're so focused on the Quad, you know, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. And it's that change in not just confronting China. And I think one of the most significant, you know, tells coming out of the US-Japan summit we had was the announcement on 5G and the billions that are going to go into 5G, because the Trump administration, it was saying to all of our allies, you will not use Huawei, you will not use 5G, full stop. Now, the approach of the Quad is, let's provide solutions, let's provide alternatives, let's give you an option to having to use, you know, Huawei and 5G. Let's give you an option when it comes to investment in Southeast Asia, across Asia Pacific. And so it's now not just don't participate in Belt and Road. It's now we're going to give you an alternative, and we're going to give you alternative financing and investment. And so these opportunities of a change of approach towards China, which is all about just don't do something, to offering solutions, is going to give huge opportunities to investors across the region and in the United States and Australia as well.
The other theme, just in the 10 or so minutes that we've got left with you both this morning, we could probably talk for hours about this theme on climate, but we should really speak a little bit about the opportunity set that comes on the back of this. We're all reading about, of course, the Biden-led leadership summit on climate, which kicks off this week, I think in a couple of days from now in the US or US time, is seeking clearly to challenge the world to do more on this issue. But so far, Steve, perhaps to you first on this, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, there appears to be probably some slow progress, I think, in driving the immediate change and the leadership level commitment that he's been looking for. Do you think the summit will be a catalyst for the acceleration in both focus and leadership commitment and buy-in that Biden is hoping for?
Well, the U.S. does not have a great track record on international climate accords. We're in, we're out.
Mm.
We're in Kyoto, we're out Kyoto, we're in Paris, we're out of Paris, we're back in Paris. And so, can you trust the
Yeah.
United States beyond the 4 years of this administration? And that's a real challenge that the United States is going to have to overcome. And so, this is just one step in a process. Or obviously, you have this summit in Washington, and then COP26 is going to come up. I think it's October, November.
Later in the year.
Yeah, later in the year in Glasgow, right? That's the next step. And what type of commitments will you have? So that is going to be a longer process. But the United States has to put its money where its mouth is, and so one of the things that the U.S. is doing now is focusing on the development part of foreign policy. I mean, kind of think of the foreign policy has kind of 3 Ds, right? There's defense, diplomacy, and development. And now development is going to be much more integrated into the U.S. foreign policy. You see things like what used to be called OPIC, which is now the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, is going to start putting much more money into Southeast Asia. It's underinvested in this part of the world. It's going to look at clean energy solutions, and the U.S. IDFC no longer needs a nexus to the United States in order to invest. So if you're an Australian investor doing a public-private partnership in a clean energy investment in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, wherever, you're eligible for U.S. government-led investment, because it's in the U.S. interest to see that type of sustainable investing in this part of the world, not ceding the playing field to China. So there is that mindset of climate, and it's not just Paris, it's not just COP26, it's beyond that as well. And there are short-term opportunities already for investors who are looking to take advantage of that.
Simon, here in Australia, Prime Minister Morrison was, as you will have followed very closely, of course, ever so gently, but quite definitively shifted his messaging in the 3 or so months that Biden has been in the driver's seat in the US. And finally, a lot of people were waiting on those 2 words to come out of Morrison's mouth. They finally did, which is net zero. Finally were uttered, I think, just a few weeks ago. But what do you make of not just the summit, but the implications of the Biden administration's focus on climate, and what does that do you see what that might result in for Australian investors?
Yeah, so we're tracking this awfully closely, as you can well imagine here. The opening, I'd say, once it became clear that Biden had won, Canberra went into a little bit of a state of excitement, concern, anxiety, that
a whole range of emotions all at once. Yeah.
In the blink of an eye, the minute that Biden puts his hands on that Bible and is sworn in, the US government, and moreover representatives of the US government in Canberra, go from being skeptical and hostile on climate change to ambitious, aspirational, wanting to reassert global leadership, perhaps even give Australia a little, nudge in the ribs now and then. And a government that's got its own, as you've alluded to, it's got its own issues with climate to do. The coalition of votes that the Morrison government has to assemble, going from the Bush and the Nats all the way through to inner city votes. The fraught politics of climate in Australia. Morrison was quite comfortable with a Trump administration that was hostile, skeptical towards, but then whoosh, all of a sudden goes from being on my right flank, perhaps, to being on my left flank, like that.
That's right.
And then everybody went, well, how's that going to go? And there was a lot of pre-positioning. And then Kerry's remarks in that literally it is 2 sentences in a TED talk with Al Gore, but boy, oh boy, that generates tons of column inches of coverage here in Australia. We had an issue. We're not quite on the same page with Australia. They were kind of a little recalcitrant, frankly. It didn't use those words, but they were part of, quote, the problem.
That's the implication. In
Madrid, So all of that got Canberra very exercised. And then, of course, we start to see the dust settle in Washington on the State of the Congress #1, and careful parsing of those early announcements that were coming out of the Biden White House. And here's the reality: both countries are essentially in technology, not tax policy channels. The thing that's really distinctive, though, about the US on that right now, and again, not letting the COVID crisis go to waste, while money is billowing out the door and you've barely got control of Congress, the stuff you can do is spend. You're not going to get anything like carbon pricing up through the current US Congress, perhaps if ever. But what you can do is offer lots of money to lots of members of Congress for EV charging networks and parts of a green economy supply chain coming to their congressional district or their state. You can get the votes for that up. And the scale of that is, I think, the real point of contrast with the US. Both countries, as I said, I think are in very much for their own political reasons, are in technology, not taxes, carrots, not sticks, if you will, being the mindset at the moment. But the scale of it in the US is the really mind-blowing thing. And I think when Australians, for investors, there's real opportunity there. Like just the sheer, if even half of it got up, if they don't spend 170 billion, suppose they spend 85, 90 billion on EV, that is just such a huge jolt in the arm for the EV industry. And there are, yes, right back in the supply chain with the lithium going with the batteries, but at other points through the supply chain, that's going to shake up the global economy in and of itself, number one. China will no longer be the only big game in town with respect to EV. But keep an eye on what else is happening. Now, the other thing, just real quickly, say on government to government, Australia sought to turn, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative. Let's stand up lots of R&D partnerships on renewable technologies. It looks like we're in the same headspace, at least on policy, those technologies. The Australian and US governments are working pretty hard behind the scenes. So I think some announceables, I think, are coming later in the year on R&D partnerships, money coming out of the US Department of Energy. Steve already mentioned those infrastructure project spending through the foreign development assistance sort of avenue, but look for R&D partnerships. And again, I'm thinking about different size enterprises in Australia and even the higher ed sector. And there's going to be real opportunity there to latch on to, I think, some low-hanging fruit coming out of government to demonstrate Australia's commitment through that technology, not taxes policy channel with the US, I think, as a partner there as well. And then what hooks off that potentially is that gateway to the much bigger procurement chains and supply chains that are available on the US side.
And I just want to do one, I was just a tiny bit just to highlight something Simon said, and it's kind of inside baseball to use American slang, is Congress got rid of a while back something called earmarks, where a member of Congress could say this money, this $1 billion or 100 million, whatever, goes to this project in my district. They got rid of that about 20, 30 years ago for perception of, if not outright corruption reasons. Earmarks are coming back. Now they're coming back with certain bounds, but now members of Congress are going to be able to say, I want to see this EV facility, this EV research, this funding go into my district. And with every member of Congress being able to do that, it is going to incentivize them to pass this bill. So I do remain somewhat optimistic that we are going to see that infrastructure pass for one of the hidden gems that Simon put into his talk.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you both. On closing this out, I know we're a couple of minutes over, but just if people will indulge me for another minute or two, I just want to throw a very quick 1 minute question to each of you. Stephen, I might start with you. The Biden administration, a couple of years out from now, what do you see as the big milestones that Biden will leave behind if he's not in the driver's seat for the second term? We will have to wait and see on what happens with him and Harris on that. But what do you think the big legacies will be for Biden a couple of years from now?
Well, the model that he's kind of positioning himself as, it's very difficult, is working with the Congress. The last real consequential Congress we had in the United States was about 50 years ago, and that was the Great Society Congress with President Johnson that addressed all of the major challenges that the United States faced at once. It addressed the environment, it addressed racial disparity, it addressed poverty reduction. It talked about education. Literally, it impacted all aspects of life. that is the model that the Democrats, the Biden executive branch, and Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi would like to envision. Let's see if they can do that. If they can do that, this could be a real transformative era, because you have that opportunity coming out of COVID, and you have the contrast with the Trump administration. If they can do that, there is going to be a second Biden-Harris administration. And if they can't, we're going to come back to another nail biter on election night, one way or the other.
Great. Okay, something to watch out for. Thanks, Steve. And Simon, to you. Big legacy for Biden. Yeah.
Returning the US to global leadership as a country that the rest of the democratic world, at least, can look up to and admire. He saw it just A, not being Trump, but B, going back into Paris literally within hours of being sworn in. And that's why today, this later this week, this summit, and then later in the year, a summit on democracy. I think those will be some of that idea that the US is back and willing to bear the costs, as John Kennedy, to shoulder any burden. That kind of America. That is so deeply ingrained in that tradition of the Democratic Party that Biden comes from, that up and out idea of American greatness. That I think, and I hope, frankly, will be one of the legacies, perhaps the most important legacy of the Biden administration. Yeah,
thank you, Simon. A good marketing tagline in and amongst that, I think. We're back. Says the US, might be the marketing campaign. But look, thank you both for being so generous with your time, your insights, and your crystal ball gazing in some ways, because I know it's still very early days in the Biden administration, but as we've observed in this discussion, he hasn't wasted any time at all so far in getting on with a whole bunch of initiatives, programs, and significant new packages to help reinforce that leadership position that the US has occupied for so long now. And the implications of that for Australia are profound, as both of you have observed. So we're going to wrap things up here. We'll continue this conversation, of course, over coming months. But thank you on behalf of the entire private capital industry here in Australia. Steve, to you, thank you for your insights. And Simon, thank you so much for your expertise and insights shared with us this morning. Look forward to talking with you both very soon.
And see you when the bubble gets created.
Of course. We look forward to
Singapore. It. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Good on you, Steve. Yeah.
We look forward to it. Thank you all. Thanks for being a part of it. Thank you to our audience. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good on you. Thanks.